The message came through broken and filled with static, but the words were clear enough to make every officer on the bridge stop breathing for a moment. Vrakari invasion. Kepler 7b, requesting immediate assistance. They are everywhere. Please help us. Admiral Thyssen stood at the center of his command deck, his tall Valorian frame casting a long shadow across the holographic display before him. And he felt the familiar weight of command pressing down on his shoulders as he processed what he had just heard. The Valorians were an ancient species, wise and measured, and Thyssen had served in the Galactic Union fleet for over 200 years. But even with all his experience, the name Vrakari still sent a cold shiver through his bones. He turned to his communications officer, a young Meridian with scales that shifted from blue to gray when she was nervous. And right now, those scales were almost white. When did this signal originate? He asked, keeping his voice steady and calm. Approximately 4 hours ago. Admiral, she replied, her fingers dancing across her console. The distance and interference delayed the transmission significantly. 4 hours, Thyssen thought to himself. And he closed his four eyes one pair at a time as he calculated the terrible mathematics of the situation. Kepler 7b was a small human mining colony at the very edge of Union space, home to perhaps 200 souls who had traveled far from their ancestral Earth to dig precious minerals from an alien world. And now those 200 humans faced an enemy that had destroyed entire civilizations. The Vrakari were insectoid creatures, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with armored exoskeletons that could withstand standard weapons fire and mandibles that could tear through metal like paper. And they moved in swarms that numbered in the thousands, feeding on the species they conquered in ways that Thyssen preferred not to remember. How many Vrakari ships have been detected in the sector? He asked his tactical officer, a grizzled Korthan veteran missing one arm from a previous war. Pulled up the sensor data with his remaining hand. 3 hive ships confirmed, Admiral, each carrying approximately 5,000 warriors, 15,000 Vrakari against 200 humans, most of whom were miners and their families with no military training whatsoever. And the math was not just unfavorable, it was a death sentence written in numbers. Time to reach Kepler 7b at maximum speed. 72 hours, Admiral. Thyssen walked slowly to the viewport and stared out at the stars. Those distant points of light that held so many worlds and so many species. And he thought about the humans who had joined the Galactic Union just 50 years ago. They were such a young species, barely stepping out of their own solar system when they made first contact. And the other races had welcomed them with a mixture of curiosity and gentle condescension. For humans seemed so fragile compared to the mighty species that had ruled the stars for millennia. Their lives were short, rarely exceeding a single century, and their bodies were soft and easily damaged, lacking the natural armor or weapons that evolution had granted to so many other intelligent beings. And yet they had spread across a dozen worlds with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Now those colonists on Kepler 7b would pay the price for their species' bold expansion into dangerous territory, Admiral, his executive officer said quietly, stepping up beside him. Standard protocol states that we should not risk fleet resources on a colony that cannot be saved. And by the time we arrive, I know what we will find, Thyssen interrupted, his voice heavy with resignation. I have seen Vrakari feeding grounds before, Commander, and I do not need you to remind me of what they leave behind. The bridge fell silent, for every officer present understood what that meant. They would arrive to find nothing but bones and blood and the terrible evidence of what happened when the Vrakari finished with the world. However, Thyssen continued, turning back to face his crew, we will go anyway, and we will document what happened, and we will recover whatever remains we can, so that the families of the fallen may have some closure. for that is the least we owe to those who trusted the Union to protect them." He gave the order, and the fleet began to move. 7 warships accelerating toward the jump point that would take them to Kepler-7b, the crew quarters of the flagship. A young human officer named Lieutenant Priya Okonkwo sat on her bunk and listened to the announcement over the ship's communication system. And she felt her hands begin to shake as the Admiral explained their mission. She was one of only a handful of humans serving in the Union fleet, having worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove that her species belonged among the stars. And now she was being told that 200 of her people were about to die if they had not died. Already the other officers in her section offered their condolences with the awkward sympathy of those who did not truly understand. For to them, humans were still newcomers, still strangers, still that odd little species from the small blue planet that had somehow stumbled into galactic civilization. "I am sorry for your people," a Valorian bunkmate said gently. "The Vrakari are merciless, and there is no shame in what will happen. For no species could stand against such numbers without proper military support." Priya nodded and thanked her for the kind words. But inside she felt something stirring that she could not quite name. She walked to the small viewport in their quarters and pressed her hand against the cold glass, staring out at the stars that were beginning to blur as the ship entered slipspace. And she thought about the colonists on Kepler-7b, the miners and engineers, the teachers and doctors, the children who had been born under an alien sun and had never seen Earth. They were ordinary people, not soldiers, not heroes, just men and women who had wanted to build a new life on a distant world, but they were still human, and Priya knew something that the Valorians and the Korthans and all the other ancient species of the Union had not yet learned. Something that was written into the very bones of her kind, passed down through countless generations of struggle and survival on a harsh and unforgiving world. Humans did not surrender. Humans did not give up. Humans fought, even when fighting was hopeless, even when the enemy was overwhelming, even when every rational calculation said that resistance was pointless. She whispered to the stars, her breath fogging the glass, and her words were both a prayer and a promise. "You do not know us yet." Marcus Cole had spent 30 years working in mines across a dozen worlds, and he had learned that the darkness underground was not something to fear, but something to respect, something to understand, something that could become your greatest ally if you knew its secrets. Now, as the Vrakari ships descended from the sky like a swarm of metal locusts, he understood that this knowledge would be the only thing standing between his people and complete annihilation. He was 54 years old, with gray in his beard and scars on his hands from decades of hard labor. And he had served in the Earth military long ago, before deciding that he preferred building things to destroying them. But today he would have to remember the lessons of his youth. "Everyone into the mines," he shouted, his voice cutting through the panic like a knife. "Take only what you can carry: water, food, weapons if you have them, and move now." The colony had no real defenses, just 12 security officers with light rifles meant for dealing with wildlife and the occasional dispute between workers. And when Marcus looked up at the sky and saw the dark shapes of Vrakari drop pods falling like rain, he knew that those 12 rifles would not be enough. But the mines were deep, and the tunnels stretched for kilometers in every direction, carved over years of excavation into a maze that only the colonists truly understood. "We cannot fight them," said Director Chan, the colony administrator, her face pale with terror. "We should surrender and hope they show mercy." Marcus grabbed her by the shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "The Vrakari do not show mercy," he said quietly. "They will kill us all regardless of whether we fight or not. So we can die on our knees begging, or we can die on our feet fighting. And I know which one I choose." He released her and turned to address the crowd of frightened colonists who had gathered in the main plaza. men and women and children looking to him for guidance. And he saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. "Listen to me," he called out. "I will not lie to you and tell you that help is coming, because the nearest Union fleet is days away and we are on our own. But I will tell you this, we know these mines better than any creature in this galaxy. We built them with our own hands, and if the Rekari want to take this colony, they will have to come down into the darkness and fight us on our ground." He pointed toward the mine entrance behind him. "Every tunnel is a choke point. Every shaft is a trap waiting to be sprung. And we have enough mining explosives to bring down half a mountain if we need to. So I am asking you, not ordering you. Asking you to stand with me and show these monsters what humans are made of." For a moment, no one moved, and Elena Cole, his wife of 28 years, stepped forward and picked up a mining pick from a nearby equipment rack. Her jaw set with determination. "You heard my husband," she said. "Get moving." The colonists moved over the next 6 hours. Marcus organized the defense with a precision that surprised even himself, dividing the survivors into groups and assigning each one a section of the tunnel network to defend. The children and those too old or sick to fight were sent to the deepest levels, protected by thick rock and carefully hidden passages that only a handful of people knew about. And Marcus made sure that each shelter had enough supplies to last for weeks. The rest of the colonists became soldiers. They rigged mine charges at key intersections, creating kill zones where a single detonation could collapse tons of rock onto any enemy foolish enough to advance. And they rerouted the plasma vents used for cutting through ore so that they could be activated remotely, turning entire corridors into furnaces. The security officers distributed their weapons and taught basic shooting to anyone who would listen, while the engineers modified mining equipment into improvised weapons. Rock drills became spears, ore carts became barricades, and the heavy-lifting exoskeletons used for moving equipment became armored suits when the first Rekari warriors entered the mines. They expected easy prey. They found something very different. The opening battle lasted 3 hours, and when it was over, more than 200 Rekari bodies lay scattered across the entrance tunnels, torn apart by explosions and burned by plasma, and shot down in the narrow passages where their superior numbers meant nothing. The humans lost 11 people in that first fight, and Marcus said words over each of them before ordering the retreat to the second defensive line. Day 2 was worse. The Rekari adapted, sending smaller groups that could navigate the tunnels more effectively, and they began to learn the layout of the mines by sheer trial and error, losing hundreds of warriors to map the passages with their own dead. Marcus fought in the front lines, his old military training coming back like muscle memory, and he watched men and women he had known for years fall beside him, their blood mixing with the alien ichor that covered the tunnel floors. Elena was hit on the 42nd hour, a Rekari blade catching her across the stomach as she held a barricade so that others could retreat. And Marcus reached her just in time to see the light fading from her eyes. "Keep them safe," she whispered, her hand gripping his with the last of her strength. "Promise me." "I promise," he said. And he held her until she was gone. He allowed himself 30 seconds to grieve. 30 seconds of silent tears in the darkness, and then he picked up her rifle and returned to the fighting. By the end of day 2, the humans had been pushed back to the third defensive line, but the Rekari losses were catastrophic, with thousands of warriors dead in the tunnels and more dying every hour as the colonists continued to spring traps and ambush. The Rekari commander could not understand what was happening. These were supposed to be civilians, soft creatures without claws or armor or any natural weapons. And yet they fought like cornered predators, refusing to break no matter how many of them fell on day 3. Something changed. The humans stopped retreating. Marcus gathered the 83 survivors who could still fight and looked at each of them in turn, seeing the exhaustion and grief and pain in their faces, but also seeing something else, a cold, hard anger that burned brighter than any fear. "They expect us to keep running," he said. "They expect us to hide in the deepest holes until they dig us out. And they think that every meter they push us back is a victory." He lifted his rifle and checked the charge. "I say we show them what a mistake that is." The counterattack began at hour 70, and it was unlike anything the Valkyrie had ever experienced. The humans came out of the darkness like ghosts, striking from passages the enemy thought were collapsed, appearing behind Valkyrie lines through maintenance shafts too small for the aliens to use, and fighting with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They reclaimed tunnel after tunnel, driving the Valkyrie back toward the surface. And the alien warriors, who had conquered 100 worlds and never known defeat, began to feel something unfamiliar, spreading through their ranks fear by hour 71. Marcus Cole stood in the main hub of the colony, surrounded by his surviving people. Facing the last Valkyrie commander, the alien was wounded, one of its 4 arms hanging useless, and it looked at the human before it with something like confusion in its compound eyes. "You should not have been able to do this," it hissed in broken standard. Marcus raised the pickaxe that had belonged to his grandfather, the same tool he had carried to every world he had ever worked on, now stained with alien blood. "You should not have come here," he replied, and he brought the axe down. The Galactic Union fleet dropped out of slipspace exactly 72 hours after receiving the distress call, and Admiral Thiessen stood on his bridge with the heavy heart of someone who knew exactly what he was about to find. He had done this before, arriving too late at worlds the Valkyrie had touched, and he knew the signs, the burning cities, the scattered remains, the terrible silence that fell over a place where all life had been consumed. "Begin scanning the surface," he ordered, his voice flat and professional. "I want a full assessment of the damage before we send anyone down." His tactical officer worked at his console for several long moments, and then the Corthan veteran made a sound that Thiessen had never heard him make before, something between a gasp and a choking noise. "Admiral," the officer said, his voice strange and uncertain, "the Valkyrie hive ships are present in orbit. All 3 of them." "I expected as much," Thiessen replied. "What is their status?" "They are dark, sir. No power signatures, no life signs, nothing at all, and they appear to be drifting without any control." Thiessen blinked all 4 of his eyes in confusion. "Drifting? Have they been damaged?" "I am not detecting any external damage, Admiral, but I am also not detecting any crew aboard. And that should be impossible, because each of those ships should carry 5,000 warriors, plus support personnel." The bridge fell silent as everyone tried to process what they were hearing, because Valkyrie hive ships did not simply go dark. They were living vessels in some ways, tied to the hive mind of the swarm. And for all 3 to lose power simultaneously suggested something catastrophic. "Scan the surface," Thiessen commanded. "Tell me what happened to the colony." More silence followed as the sensors did their work, and when the results came through, the tactical officer turned to face his admiral with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sir, I am detecting human life signs on the surface, multiple signatures, clustered near the mining complex." "Survivors?" Thiessen asked, hardly daring to believe it. "How many?" "Approximately 130, Admiral, including what appear to be children." The Admiral gripped the railing in front of him so hard that his knuckles turned pale. Because this was impossible. Survivors of a Valkyrie invasion simply did not exist. Not without military intervention, not without a fleet to drive the swarm away, and the Valkyrie ground forces? He asked. "I am detecting no living Valkyrie anywhere on the planet, sir. But I am detecting massive concentrations of biological matter consistent with Valkyrie remains thousands upon thousands of dead scattered throughout the mining tunnels and the surrounding area. Thiessen stood perfectly still for a moment, his ancient mind struggling to comprehend what he was being told. And then he turned to his communications officer. "Get me the Marine commander." Immediately, within the hour, the first dropships descended toward the surface of Kepler 7b, carrying elite Union Marines who had been prepared to recover bodies and document an atrocity. And they landed near the colony's main complex with weapons ready for any threat. The Marine commander, a battle-hardened Deshan named Cora, led her team toward the mining hub entrance. And what she saw there stopped her in her tracks. Bodies everywhere, but not human bodies. Rekaree corpses were piled in heaps around the entrance. Thousands of them, torn apart by explosions and burned by some kind of thermal weapon and shot through with countless projectile wounds. And the carnage extended as far as she could see into the tunnel. Beyond, she opened her communication channel and tried to speak, but no words came out, and for 3 full minutes, her team simply stood there in silence, staring at the impossible evidence before them. Finally, movement in the tunnel entrance caught her attention, and she raised her weapon instinctively before realizing that the figures emerging from the darkness were human. They came out slowly, blinking in the sunlight they had not seen in 3 days, and they looked like ghosts covered in dust and blood, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted beyond description. But they were alive. A man at the front of the group, older than the others, with gray in his beard and one arm hanging in a makeshift sling, walked forward to meet the Marines. "I am Marcus Cole," he said, his voice rough from shouting orders over 3 days of constant battle. "I am the foreman of this mining operation, and I suppose you are the reinforcements we were promised." Cora finally found her voice. "Admiral," she said into her communicator, her words coming out shaky and strange. "Admiral, they are alive, the humans are alive, and the Vrakkari are all dead. Every single one of them." Admiral Thiessen descended to the surface personally within the hour, something he had not done in decades. And he walked through the killing fields with a growing sense of awe that he had not felt since he was young. The numbers were staggering. His officers counted the dead as they moved through the tunnels, and the final tally would take days to complete. But early estimates suggested that over 14,000 Vrakkari warriors had died in these mines, killed by civilians, by miners and engineers and teachers, by humans who had never seen combat before. This week, when Thiessen finally reached the main hub, he found Marcus Cole sitting on a piece of rubble, watching as medics tended to the wounded survivors and children emerged from the deep shelters where they had hidden. The Admiral approached the human and stood before him in silence for a long moment, unsure what to say, because all his years of experience and all his wisdom had not prepared him for this. "Your people called for help," Thiessen finally said, "and we came as quickly as we could. But I confess that I expected to find only death when we arrived." Marcus looked up at the tall alien, and despite his exhaustion, there was still fire in his eyes. "We were not planning to die," he said simply. "The Vrakkari have destroyed civilizations," Thiessen continued. "They have wiped out species that were older than my own, and they have never, not once in recorded history, been defeated by a force so outnumbered and so poorly armed as yours. So I must ask you the question that every officer in my fleet is asking right now." He leaned down slightly to look the human in the eyes. "How did you do this?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and his gaze drifted across the hub to where the survivors were gathering. Old men who had fought with mining tools, young women who had held barricades against waves of enemies, teenagers who had carried ammunition through the darkness, and children who had stayed silent in the deep tunnels because their parents told them to be brave. "We had something to protect," he said at last. "And humans do not abandon what we love, Admiral. Not ever. Not for any reason. Not even when the whole galaxy tells us that we should." He stood up slowly, wincing at the pain from a dozen wounds. and offered his hand to the Valorian. "Thank you for coming anyway," he added. "Even when you thought it was hopeless." Admiral Thiessen took the human's hand and shook it, and he felt something shift in his understanding of the universe, a recognition that perhaps the Galactic Union had made a profound error in its assessment of humanity. These were not fragile creatures, these were not soft and weak newcomers who needed protection. These were something else entirely, something that the galaxy had not seen in a very long time. And Thiessen was beginning to suspect that the universe was about to learn a lesson it had forgotten. He looked at Marcus Cole, this ordinary man who had led civilians against an army and won. And he saw in those tired human eyes the same thing that had burned in the hearts of every great warrior race the galaxy had ever known. Saw the refusal to surrender. He saw the will to fight. He saw something that made him, for the first time in centuries, feel very glad that humans had decided to be friends rather than enemies. "You are welcome," he said quietly. "I believe that my report to the Galactic Council will be very different from what any of us expected." 3 days after the battle ended, while medical teams treated the wounded and engineers began the long process of restoring power to the damaged colony, Admiral Thiessen ordered a complete survey of the mine network with standard procedure following any incident of this magnitude, a way to document everything that had happened and ensure that no Vakari survivors remained hidden in the deepest tunnels. And so teams of Union soldiers and scientists spread throughout the labyrinth with scanners and recording equipment. Lieutenant Priya Okonkwo was assigned to one of these survey teams. Finally able to walk on the surface of the world she had feared would become a graveyard for her people, and she moved through the tunnels with a mixture of sorrow and pride as she saw the evidence of what the colonists had accomplished. Every corridor told a story. Here, a barricade made from orc arts, where miners had held off wave after wave of attackers. There, a collapsed section where someone had triggered explosives to bury dozens of enemies. Everywhere, the marks of desperate struggle and incredible courage. Her team reached Shaft 7 Gamma on the morning of the 4th day, a deep section of the mines that the colonists had sealed off early in the fighting and never reopened. And the scanner readings from beyond the barrier were strange enough that the team leader decided to investigate. "There is something behind this wall," the Meridian scientist said, studying her equipment with confusion. "An empty space that does not appear on any of the mining surveys. And the rock formation suggests that it predates the colony by a significant margin." "How significant?" Priya asked. "I am reading geological signatures that suggest this chamber has existed for approximately 4 million years. The team exchanged glances, because nothing about that made any sense. This world had been surveyed before colonization, and no one had detected any anomalies of this kind. They cut through the sealed barrier and discovered a tunnel behind it that had not been carved by human hands. A passage that sloped downward into the darkness, with walls too smooth and too perfect to be natural. And at the end of that passage, they found a door. The door was made of a material that none of their instruments could identify. Dark as obsidian, but with a faint luminescence that seemed to pulse slowly like a heartbeat. And there were symbols carved into its surface that matched no known language in the galactic archives. "We should call the Admiral," the team leader said nervously. "Wait," Priya said, stepping forward. "Let me try something." She did not know why she did what she did next. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps something deeper that she could not name. But she reached out and pressed her palm against the doorlight erupted from the symbols, racing across the surface in patterns that seemed almost alive. And the door began to open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing a chamber beyond that took her breath away. It was vast, far larger than should have been possible this deep underground. And at its center stood a crystalline structure twice the height of a human. pulsing with soft blue light that shifted and flowed like water trapped in glass, but it was not the crystal that made Priya gasp. It was the walls. Every surface of the chamber was covered in pictographs, images carved into the stone with impossible precision, depicting scenes that seemed to stretch across time and space. She saw worlds burning and civilizations falling, armies of darkness spreading across the stars like a plague. And against that tide of destruction, she saw figures standing firm, bipedal creatures with 2 arms and 2 legs, faces that were unmistakably human in their shape and expression, holding weapons of light against the encroaching void. "This is impossible," the Meridian scientist whispered. "These images are as old as the chamber itself, 4 million years old, but humans only evolved on Earth 200,000 years ago." Priya walked deeper into the chamber, her eyes moving from image to image as she tried to understand what she was seeing. And the story told by the pictographs became clearer with each step. She saw human figures on a dozen different worlds, standing guard at places just like this one. And she saw those same figures falling back over eons, retreating, hiding, until only one small blue planet remained, a world on the edge of a quiet galaxy where a remnant population could wait and grow and remember. "We did not evolve on Earth," she said quietly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "We were placed there, hidden there, waiting for something." Admiral Thyssen arrived within the hour, accompanied by the Union's most senior scientists and historians, and they studied the chamber with the kind of reverent silence usually reserved for sacred places. The crystalline structure at the center resisted all attempts at analysis. It was not made of any element in the periodic table. It generated energy from no detectable source, and it seemed to exist partially outside of normal space in ways that the scientists could not explain. But the pictographs were clear enough for anyone to read. "These images depict the war," said the chief historian, a very old Valorian who had spent his entire life studying the remnants of extinct civilizations. "A war fought across the entire galaxy against an enemy that is represented here only as darkness, a void that consumes everything it touches." He pointed to a sequence of images near the back of the chamber. "And these figures, these humans, appear to be the primary opposition to that enemy, fighting for millions of years across countless worlds, sacrificing everything to hold back the tide." "But who created this place?" Thyssen asked. "Who carved these images and built this vault?" "I believe the humans did," the historian replied. "Or rather, the ancestors of the humans, a far older and more advanced version of the species that exists today. One that fought the war depicted here, and eventually went into hiding when the cost became too great." He turned to look at Priya, who stood near the crystal with an expression of dazed wonder on her face. "The question is not who created this vault. The question is why it exists, and what it was meant to protect." Priya reached out toward the crystal, drawn by something she could not explain, a pull that felt like recognition, like coming home after a very long journey. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the entire chamber blazed with light, and she felt something vast and ancient flow into her mind. Not words exactly, but concepts, memories, a weight of ages pressing against her consciousness. She saw the enemy clearly now. Not darkness, but something that lived within darkness. Something that had existed since before the first stars were born and had hungered for the light of living things, ever since she saw her ancestors standing against it. Generation after generation, building weapons and fortresses and hidden vaults throughout the galaxy. Fighting a war so long that it outlasted stars themselves. She saw them finally retreating, hiding the last of their power in places like this one, and seeding a young world called Earth with a population that carried their blood, but had forgotten their purpose. She saw the plan that desperate hoped that one day, when the enemy returned, the children of that scattered remnant would remember who they were and take up the fight once more. And then she heard a voice, old beyond comprehension, but somehow familiar. speaking directly into her soul. The wardens have remembered themselves. Priya collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. And when Thiessen rushed to help her, she looked up at him with eyes that had seen something no living being had witnessed in 4 million years. The Vrekkari were not here by accident, she said, her voice shaking. Something called them to this world, something that sensed the vault was close to being discovered, and they were sent to destroy it before we could find it. She looked at the crystal, still pulsing with that soft blue light. But they failed, she continued. And now everything changes, because we were never just colonists. Admiral, we were never just miners and farmers spreading through the galaxy. We were guardians placed in hiding, waiting for the moment when we would be needed again. Thiessen stared at her, and then at the ancient images covering the walls. And he felt the weight of what he was learning settle onto his shoulders like a mountain. Needed for what? He asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Priya looked toward the final sequence of pictographs, images of the darkness retreating, wounded but not destroyed, waiting at the edges of reality for its moment to return, for the war that never ended, she said, for the enemy that is still out there, watching and waiting, and for the reckoning that our ancestors knew would eventually come. The light of the crystal pulsed once more, strong and steady, and somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, something ancient and hungry stirred in its sleep. It had felt the awakening, and it had begun to remember as well. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler 7b, the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Union convened in the Great Hall on Desser Prime to hear Admiral Thiessen deliver his report. Representatives from over 200 species filled the chamber. Beings of every shape and size and form that evolution had crafted across 1 million worlds. And they had gathered because rumors of what happened in that distant mining colony had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Some said the humans had fought off a Vrekkari invasion. Through sheer luck, some they had discovered ancient technology that gave them an unfair advantage. Some said the whole story was propaganda designed to make the newcomer species seem more impressive than they really were. Admiral Thiessen stood at the central podium and, prepared to tell them the truth, honored representatives, he began, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. I have served the Galactic Union for 237 years. And in that time, I have witnessed things both wondrous and terrible. The birth of new civilizations and the death of old ones. The triumph of peace and the tragedy of war. But I have never seen anything like what I found on Kepler 7b. He activated the holographic display behind him, showing images of the battlefield, the tunnel networks, the endless piles of Vrekkari dead. 200 human civilians held off 15,000 Vrekkari warriors for 72 hours without any military support whatsoever. And when my fleet arrived expecting to recover their bodies, we found them standing victorious among the corpses of their enemies. Murmurs swept through the assembly, doubt and disbelief mixing with reluctant admiration. I have heard the whispers in this chamber, Thiessen continued. The suggestions that perhaps the humans cheated somehow, or that my report exaggerates their accomplishment. And so I have brought visual recordings of every tunnel, every barricade, every fallen enemy, all of which will be made available for your examination. He paused and looked across the gathered representatives. But that is not the most important thing I have to tell you today. The display changed, showing images of the vault beneath the mines. The ancient pictographs, the crystalline artifact that still pulsed with unreadable energy. We found something beneath that colony, something that predates every civilization currently represented in this chamber by millions of years, and it tells a story that will change everything we thought we knew about the galaxy and our place in it. He told them about the images on the walls, the war against the darkness, the human figures standing as guardians across countless worlds, And he told him about the voice that Lieutenant Okonkwo had heard when she touched the crystal when he finished. The chamber was silent then. The Vakari ambassador rose from her seat, a towering figure with compound eyes that showed no emotion. And she spoke in a voice that carried the weight of an empire built on conquest. The Vakari Dominion rejects this fantasy. She declared, "We attacked that colony because it was undefended, and the humans were weak. There was no ancient enemy guiding our actions. No cosmic purpose, nothing but the natural order of predator and prey." "Then why?" Deason replied calmly. "Did your hive ships lose all power the moment the battle ended? Why did 15,000 of your warriors die fighting civilians when they have conquered military installations with far less cost? And why?" He fixed her with all four of his eyes. "Has your empress ordered all Vakari fleets to avoid human space for the foreseeable future?" The ambassador had no answer across the galaxy. In a throne room carved from the bones of conquered species, the Vakari empress watched the assembly through a relay feed and felt cold spreading through her exoskeleton. She had given those orders because her hive mind had felt something during the battle on Kepler-7b, a presence that had touched the consciousness of every Vakari warrior in those tunnels, an ancient awareness that had whispered a single word as her soldiers died: "Remember." She did not know what she was supposed to remember, but for the first time in her long reign, the Empress had tasted fear. And she had decided that the humans were not prey worth hunting, not yet. Not until she understood what had protected them back on Kepler-7b. Marcus Cole stood at the entrance to the rebuilt mining complex and watched ships come and go. From the orbital station above, the colony was being rebuilt. But it would never be just a mining operation again. Scientists from across the Union were arriving daily to study the vault and its contents. And the children who had hidden in the deepest tunnels were now celebrities throughout civilized space. The youngest heroes in galactic history, representatives, had come to offer Marcus medals and titles and seats on important councils. And he had turned them all down. "You could be famous," a Union diplomat had told him. "You could speak before the Grand Assembly, advise governments, shape policy. Why would you refuse?" Marcus had looked at him with tired eyes that had seen too much death. "Because someone has to teach the next generation," he said. "Someone has to stay here and rebuild what we lost and make sure these children grow up knowing how to protect what matters. And that job is more important than any medal." He thought about Elena every day, her laugh, her courage, the way she had picked up that mining pick and started the whole colony moving when everyone else was frozen with fear. And he knew that she would have wanted him to stay, to keep his promise, to guard the future she had died to protect. The diplomat had left eventually, and Marcus had returned to work. Lieutenant Priya Okonkwo did not return to her post on the Admiral's flagship. Instead, she was reassigned to a classified research division, tasked with studying the crystal and learning to understand the visions it had shown her. She dreamed every night, now dreams of other vaults on other worlds, hidden beneath mountains and oceans and ancient ruins, waiting to be found. And she knew that Kepler-7b was only the beginning. The voice that had spoken to her in the vault came sometimes when she was awake, guiding her toward fragments of knowledge that her ancestors had left behind, teaching her things that no living being had known for millions of years. She was becoming something new, or perhaps something very old, and she did not know yet whether to be frightened or grateful. "The wardens have remembered themselves," the voice had said. And Priya was beginning to understand what that meant. Humanity was waking up across a dozen worlds. Other humans were starting to dream similar dreams, to feel similar stirrings, to sense that they were part of something larger than they had ever imagined on Earth. A professor of ancient history discovered patterns in cave paintings that seemed to match the pictographs from the vault on a colony ship traveling to the outer rim. A child drew pictures of places she had never been and people she had never met. and her drawings matched the ancient images perfectly on Mars. Construction workers digging foundations for a new habitat broke through into a chamber that should not have existed, and they found symbols on the walls that made them feel strangely at home. The galaxy was vast and old and filled with dangers, but humanity was no longer alone in facing them. They had their past, their hidden legacy, their sleeping guardians scattered across the stars, and they were beginning to remember who they were meant to be. Far away, in the Great Hall on Desser Prime, a Valorian diplomat left the assembly after hearing Admiral Thiesen's report and walked through the streets of the capital city in a daze. She passed through markets and parks and residential districts, watching the citizens of 100 worlds go about their daily lives. And then she came to a plaza where human tourists were gathering. For a guided tour, she stopped and watched. Thema Mother lifted her young son onto her shoulders so he could see the famous fountain at the center of the plaza, and both of them laughed at some private joke that the diplomat could not hear. Their faces bright with simple happiness, such small creatures. She thought such brief lives, so fragile and soft, so utterly unremarkable in every physical way, and yet she remembered the oldest archives in the Valorian temple libraries. Scrolls so ancient that they crumbled at a touch. Written in languages that even her scholars could not fully translate, one phrase appeared in those archives again and again, repeated in every dead language of every extinct civilization that the Valorians had catalogued over their long history. Do not wake the wardens. No one had ever known who the wardens were or why they should not be woken. But scholars had debated the meaning for millennia, assuming it was a myth, a legend, a warning about some long-forgotten threat that no longer mattered. The diplomat watched the human mother set her son down, watched them walk away hand in hand toward the next attraction, watched them disappear into the crowd of tourists from a dozen worlds, and she understood now. She understood why the ancients had written those words. And she understood why every species that had encountered the wardens had eventually fallen silent, leaving behind only warnings and empty ruins. It was not because the wardens were evil. It was not because they were destructive or cruel or hungry for conquest. It was because when the wardens woke, it meant that something far worse was coming, something that required beings capable of fighting wars that lasted longer than stars. Something that demanded guardians who would never surrender no matter the cost. She looked up at the sky, at the distant stars that seemed so peaceful from this quiet plaza, and she wondered what was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting, preparing to test this galaxy's defenses.